Of all his games, Miyazaki said that Bloodborne has stayed in his heart the most. I believe I did it my way, the way I wanted it. It is what most struck me. I feel like this statement will resonate with a lot of people, because people love Bloodborne. In fact, I'd say it's actually in the running for the most beloved IP From has created, even up against Dark Souls, which spans 3 games and reached a much wider multi-platform audience. Basically, Bloodborne has a cult following within a community that is already a cult following. Despite this, From Software and Sony have yet to announce a sequel. When asked about Bloodborne 2, Miyazaki said that the decision isn't his to make, it's Sony's, which is something he also said about Demon's Souls right before the remake, mind you. So it's possible, likely even, that we will eventually see Bloodborne 2 on the PS5, but what would a sequel even look like? Would we return to the dim streets of Yharnam, or somewhere else entirely? What comes next in the ending with the waking world? Or what does it truly mean to ascend? What new trick weapons would we wield? Which nightmare realms would we explore? And do hints at Bloodborne 2 already exist in their other games? Artists, we beg you. As you once did in previous art competitions, grant us eyes. Grant us eyes.
Plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy.
This art competition is called Imagining Bloodborne 2, and it's the 5th and final art competition on the channel, for the foreseeable future at least. Artists will be competing for their slice of $2,500, split between the top 10 winners who, along with some runners-up, will also receive a favourable shout-out on the channel. In this competition, you can draw anything, as long as it relates to the theme of Bloodborne 2. So whether your strength is in environments, weapons, bosses, enemies, NPCs, it's all on the table. If you're interested in competing, you can learn the explicit rules and guidelines at the end of this video, but until then, for the sake of everyone's insight, I want to discuss the themes, the allure, and the lore of Bloodborne. A good place to start in understanding the story of Bloodborne are the couple of overview videos I've done on it. Alternatively, you could also go and read The Pale Blood Hunt, a comprehensive essay by DMC Redgrave. By furthering your understanding of what we do know about Bloodborne, you'll naturally get an idea of what we don't know, which could be important if you're trying to imagine Bloodborne 2. For example, the game could be a prequel, set in the age of the Tumerians, or maybe it could be a sequel, taking place after one of the endings. Or maybe you have the knowledge to imagine something else, maybe a sort of parallel story that occurs somewhere else entirely. Of course, thinking on a smaller scale is just as valid for the art competitions. Maybe you just want to build out a faction like the Vile Bloods or the Powder Keg Hunters. Maybe an item description hints at an area outside the game, or maybe one of the stories in the game just helps to inspire the weapon that you're designing. My point is, knowing the lore will go a long way in inspiring you for a sequel, and it's best to incorporate lore somehow. When we started playing Bloodborne in 2015, we thought we had a grip on what it was. Just a stereotypical Victorian-era horror story, right? Infected townsfolk, trench coats, werewolves, Night of the Hunt. Got it. You think you know what you're getting into until you don't. Sooner or later, something should feel off. Maybe it was when you found the aliens tucked away in the woods. Or perhaps it was when you gave that password at the door, only to find that you were talking to an inanimate corpse on the other side. There was that moment when you were lifted into the sky and crushed by an invisible force, and God forbid you have enough insight to figure out what you were just crushed by. At the core of Bloodborne isn't really the werewolves, it's not the Gothic architecture, it's the fear of the unknown. It's the idea that mankind are swept up by the tides created by greater beings, and that the truth is so vast and terrifying that it would destroy you if only you could understand it. The developers even built this concept of terrible truth into the gameplay with a mechanic called Insight. Insight is a resource that you gain when you witness certain things. Things like seeing the cleric beast for the first time, or witnessing the aliens tucked away in the forest. Insight can be used to purchase powerful items, but having too much can actually be a burden. Some enemies gain new attacks, your frenzy resistance is reduced, and you might also start to see and hear unsettling things. So the developers were definitely trying to create something with the Insight mechanic that represents both the human desire to seek knowledge and also the inability of the human mind to comprehend terrible truths. That's cosmic horror, and that's Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft pioneered this sort of horror back in the early 20th century, and if you want to better understand Bloodborne, then you should definitely go and read some of his stories. For example, The Shadow over Innsmouth largely inspired The Fishing Hamlet. Mountains Over Madness has great analogues to the Chalice dungeons, and The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath references many worlds of dream and nightmare. If you're looking to enter the art competition, I have no doubt that you will find a ton of inspiration in the Lovecraft mythos, especially if you go and read some of the stories that I didn't just mention. Now, while I consider Lovecraft to be largely inseparable from Bloodborne, I feel like the Victorian era Gothic vibe isn't. I think it'd be kind of fascinating to see Bloodborne 2 take place in a different cultural background. I've kind of speculated on this before, in a video I made back when the Shadows Die Twice teaser wasn't confirmed to be for Sekiro, and it got me thinking then about a sort of Japanese Lovecraftian horror, and personally I'd love to see the influence of the Great Ones spread to different historical settings. But what do you think? It's also possible that the aesthetic of Bloodborne is very rooted in the Victorian era. The question is, do we think that this Gothic setting could be meaningfully expanded in a sequel, or would we prefer to go somewhere else entirely? I think both options are valid. There were even rumors a while back that an Aztec setting could be a future place for From Software to explore. Coincidentally, this was around the same time Déraciné was released, which is a PSVR game made by From Software that, naturally, very few people had the hardware to play. It was a good game, but ultimately most people heard about Déraciné because it contained a few references to Bloodborne, most notable being this small doll, and perhaps this book titled Blood and Bones, along with an intriguing description that you should pause and read on screen. The cover features a lightly dressed warrior, equipped with what look like claws in his left hand, with a bird returning to his shoulder. In order to render this in more detail, I commissioned Sebastian Francini, who is an incredibly talented illustrator whose work has actually kind of become the face of the channel in recent months. Please go and follow their socials down below. They're an amazing artist. This is our take on the character on the book cover, but it's not the only way you could interpret it. This moon could actually be a sun or an eclipse. Perhaps these are crows or ravens or eagles. Perhaps it's this Mesoamerican themed desert Aztec warrior, or perhaps it's just a classic hunter. What do you think? Many people, including me, speculated that these references in Déraciné could actually be a nod towards Bloodborne 2, and enough people were saying this to the point where From Software actually commented, which is pretty rare for them, saying that they just put these things in Déraciné as Easter eggs, and that they did not intend to cause great inconvenience to Sony by spreading these rumors. I hardly feel like hype for a Bloodborne sequel is a great inconvenience to Sony. It's probably a good thing from their perspective, if anything, but I do kind of feel bad for helping to spread those rumors. So I will say this, the last thing I want to do is put pressure on From Software or Sony to create something that they don't want to make. Hell, myself and many others I know actually think that Bloodborne stands very well on its own and doesn't even need a sequel at all. But that said, speculation is fun, art is good, discussion about Bloodborne is healthy, and these competitions exist in their own little world, and it should be considered separate from any official endorsement by From Software and Sony. But I really can't imagine that Sony aren't courting From Software in some way. They must be a really enviable developer to work with. Sony was really pleased with the success of Bloodborne. From Software's Sekiro went on to win a major Game of the Year award, and now Sony has the PlayStation 5, which will eventually need hardcore fans to drive hardware sales. So I would love to see what a next-gen Bloodborne could look and play like, especially because console players are finally going to understand how painful 30 frames per second has been this past generation. And that kind of brings me to gameplay. Bloodborne's gameplay is defined by a few things. First, there's the health regain mechanic, where you can recoup some health by striking back at an enemy after they've hit you. Second, there are trick weapons that transform with a button press to present this wider array of attacks. Third, Bloodborne's combat really revolves around dodging, which contrasts with the blocking focus of Dark Souls or the parrying focus of Sekiro. Fourth, blood vials heal you quickly, and can be farmed out in the world. 5th, the map design loops back on itself quite often, with many opportunities for shortcuts. And lastly, insight, which we mentioned earlier. But there's more, of course. And I mention these things because if you were to imagine Bloodborne 2, how would you innovate on this gameplay? Would you innovate on this gameplay? Personally, for example, I'd like to see more fast-paced hunter-style boss fights and less giant monster boss fights, since I think Bloodborne's really fast style combat really shines in 1v1 combat with chip damage. Second, I'd probably innovate on the dodge mechanic. I'd probably give some sort of bonus if you dodge a melee attack perfectly, similar to how if you parry perfectly in Sekiro, you knock them off balance. And third, I'd like to see more weapons, especially ranged weapons and arcane spells, which I think is really limited in the original game. If you have any criticisms or thoughts like these, then work them into your entry, make your feelings known through your art. And I think most entries should mention gameplay in some way, not all of them, but it probably can't hurt to mention something about the gameplay, right? So, for example, if you're designing a trick weapon, you should make the weapon movesets and transformations and, range and maybe even damage very clear. Bosses might have paragraphs about their different phases and movesets, or maybe you want to talk about how your NPC that you drew might react when they get aggroed, that sort of thing. Even environments might have a line or two devoted to gameplay, whether there's environmental effects like poison or freezing, or how the player traverses the environment, or what they experience within the environment. This is all most likely worth a mention. It helps to ground the player in the world, and we are imagining a video game, after all. I actually also made a community post asking what people would like to see from Bloodborne 2, and it received over 3,500 replies, so if you're having trouble getting inspiration for your art competition, go and comb through that post, and also the comments in this video, maybe you'll realize that Bloodborne 2 should be a Bergenworth high school dating simulator with microtransactions. Who knows? I'd also recommend looking back at the previous 4 art competitions for a better idea of what criteria are important to the judges, so you can turn your concept, whatever it is, into a frontrunner. I can't wait to see what our artists can come up with. I seriously feel like we have some of the most talented artists in the industry, in our community, and I hope that everything I just talked about serves as a good foundation for your inspiration. So now let's talk about more explicit rules and guidelines for your submission. The due date for your submission is around 2 months from now, April 1st, 11 PM PST. There's a tiny bit of leeway on this, so don't stress out if you're a day or two late. Make sure you convert your image or images into an attachable JPEG or PNG and submit it to bloodborne2challenge@gmail.com. Try to render your image in a size that can be attached to an email, but if it's too big, please upload it to a cloud service and link me to it, and make sure that you have your permissions set correctly so that I can view it. In the body of your email, please include the name you'd like to go by, your PayPal address, and a link to your artist portfolio or social media if you have them. If your submission has lore, gameplay, or any written description really, then you can either write this in the body of your email, or you can make it a part of your artwork, or you can attach a document with that information. If you have additional questions, just join the Discord link in the description and check out the FAQ channel and our art chat, where moderators can answer your questions in real time. I'd also like to give a bit of a disclaimer, like I did in the last video, that by entering this art competition, you're giving me permission to potentially include your art in this art book that I'd really like to make. I want to immortalize these entries in a better format than video, and I want the art book to feature people who weren't just in the top 10. I want to open it up to a lot more people and give them a bit of credit as well. So if you're chosen to be in the art book, I will of course contact you and we can figure out how to best represent you and your art in the book. And so far I am committed to getting every artist who is included a free copy of the book at least, if it is ever made. And I'm also working on some other methods of funding your reimbursement as well, but I can't confirm that this will happen at the moment, but I am trying. So thank you for your contributions to this community. Art competitions bring myself and everyone who watches them so much joy. So thank you. I can't wait to see what you create, seriously. And I'll talk to you then.